Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Finneran's Wake. I am, with unwavering fidelity to the cause of great conversation, your friend and host, Daniel Finneran. I'm joined today by a very special guest, by whom every impediment to our appreciation of art will be, in the course of 12 brief hours, removed. Noah Charney. The author of over a dozen celebrated books, Noah most recently published The 12-Hour Art Expert, across which I had the good fortune to stumble while at my local library the other day. It's an excellent entree into art for the layperson like me, and I strongly encourage you to add it to your Amazon cart and purchase yourself a copy. You'll forever be grateful to me for having advised you to do so. Noah has also written extensively on art thievery. His novel, The Art Thief, was a bestseller in 5 countries, and he is the founder of the Association for Research into Crimes Against Art. His work on Giorgio Vasari was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. He's been a visiting lecturer at many prestigious universities, and he currently resides with his wife and daughters in Slovenia. Noah, welcome to my humble show, and thank you so very much for agreeing to join me.
Thanks so much for having me. This is going to be great.
I think it will be. So I want to begin with a quote. "The voice of our age," declared the great German poet and philosopher Friedrich Schiller, "seems by no means favorable to art." With this ominous declaration, Schiller opened the second letter of his immortal treatise called On the Aesthetic Education of Man. This work, to which I will include a link in the show notes below, was published in the year 1794. This, of course, was the year in which the French Revolution descended into the reign of terror, a radical and deadly departure from the threefold causes of liberty, fraternity, and equality of which Schiller was so enthusiastic a supporter. While we've not yet collapsed into a full-scale reign of terror, we here in the West are certainly in the throes of a cultural revolution of our own. Given that, my question to you is the voice or the spirit of our age, our current age, favorable to art?
That's a really good question, and extra credit because I'm usually asked the same dozen questions in every interview, and that is definitely not one that I've ever been asked before. So we're already off to a good start. So the thing is that every era has been one for which a death toll has sounded for art and culture. Even in the so-called Dark Ages, which is what were called the Dark Ages because it was assumed for a long time that it was one that was bereft of culture and creativity after the fall of the Roman Empire, was actually, there were some amazing things being done. They just weren't at the fore, they were in the peripheries. So I think you could have picked a quote from many different eras to say ours is not one for art, but it always has been a time for art. It's just a question of how it's consumed. And it's always been a relatively limited audience that is really all in for it. Art should be for everyone, but it's really for everyone who's willing to take a step to meet it. And that's the idea behind this new book, is to try to tear down the barriers of intimidation that I think, unfortunately, too many people within the art world kind of enjoy. It feels a little bit like a private club and not everyone's a member, when in fact, everyone who's willing to meet it halfway should be able to be. So I think that, I mean, there's a lot of questionable things going on in our era, but the same could be said for any era. So I don't think we're any worse off, if that's any consolation. What we're doing now is shifting gears, and we're becoming far more digital. Most of our lives are our eyes and a screen and what appears on that screen. And there are good things about that for convenience, certainly, and there are bad things about that. But I think the interaction with art has really just shifted gears away from travel to meet with analog objects, and a lot more to people feeling like they're getting to know art and culture through the medium of the screen, which isn't the same thing, but it's still a thing. And so I think we have to take advantage of what people are willing to come to, and the screens make engagement with art in a certain way much more accessible. So there's a benefit to that as well.
Yeah, I find it somewhat troubling to know that there's never been a time through the course of human history when so many great works of art, if not every single great work of art, is readily accessible to every single person with just the swipe of a thumb or the tap of a finger. And this is an availability for which art enthusiasts in past ages would have killed and stolen, as you know better than anyone else. And yet I fear that a lot of people aren't willing or ready or confident to take that first step, even to go on that path to meeting art halfway. So what do you think is the reservation at this time when we have such great availability to art, and yet such seemingly little impetus to pursue it?
I think part of it is our attention spans are ever shrinking, and we're getting lazier and wanting to be more productive while being less proactive. And so part of it is what's going to magically appear on one of my screens. And if it doesn't magically appear, then I'm less likely to find it. An example is, I talk primarily about traditional fine art as an art history professor. But if we just think of the sort of the Netflix era, we are delighted to watch just about anything that Netflix sort of suggests to us when we turn on the app. But there's thousands of movies available there at any given time. And if we have to go searching for it, that act of typing in the name of a movie that you maybe want to see is like one step too far for us. So the accessibility has made us feel like the world is at our fingertips, but in fact, it's really which part of the world we are fed by algorithms that suggest things that we will probably like because they're keeping track of things we tell them we like, but it means we're unlikely to be surprised by something. I think it's always a more engaged experience when you see a work of art in person. And for me, if we go back in time a little bit, when I fell in love with art was when I was 16. I went to a boarding school in the US that had abroad programs, and I spent a semester abroad in France as a student. And I had an art history class every day from 2 to 4 p.m. with Madame Poupard, my art history professor, and it was all in French, and it was all in situ. We went around to the Musée d'Orsay and the Louvre and to various castles and churches, and we saw the art in person. And of course, it was much easier to get excited about it when you're going on these little pilgrimages in an exciting city where I was living away from any parents, and it was just like a great time in general. But then you're seeing these works of art in person, and there's this real vibe, an aura, which is what Walter Benjamin called it, for lack of a more scientific term, surrounding great original works of art. And you don't get that with a digital reproduction. You don't get it through a screen. You get an aesthetic reaction. You like it or you don't. You think it's beautiful or not. It exhibits skill or not. Maybe you think it's interesting or not, but you don't get the vibe. And you need to see the work in person to have the vibe, and that requires traveling, sometimes to wayward locations. My hope is that you get this sort of initial buzz through the digital version, and it inspires you to make the actual trip. That would be the ideal way to approach it. Whether that works or not, I think it depends on the person and their circumstances. My concern, or it's not really a concern, but it would be a shame if someone feels like they have seen great works of art, buildings, they've traveled abroad, seen great sites, if they've seen like a documentary about it, or if they've just seen a digital image of it. If you feel like you've seen the Mona Lisa because you saw a picture of it online, so you don't need to go to the Louvre, it's not quite the same thing. It's like if you go to the Bellagio Casino in Vegas and say, okay, I don't have to go to Venice because I just saw a reproduction of it. It's not quite the same thing. So my hope is that it inspires people to go and see the works in person.
Yeah, you make a few very interesting remarks in those statements. The first of which I might call maybe the paradox of the freedom of choice. And that's interesting. I've never really considered it in that way, where certain images and videos are being suggested to you, either gently or firmly. And you mentioned Netflix. TikTok is probably the more ubiquitous platform on which a lot of the younger people are spending their time. And that certainly is the case, where for a true appreciation of art, whether great art, fine art, or even sort of mundane art, or even just an appreciation of nature, right? That which art imitates, you need to be able to sit down and really immerse yourself in the images that you're seeing. You need to be able to examine it, whether it's the veins on a leaf or the brush strokes on that Mona Lisa painting. And now that we have this paradox of the freedom of choice, like you said, our attention spans are ever so diminished. Do you think that they are susceptible of being enlarged again? My fear is that, over, let's say, a decade of exposure to a certain platform, if you're a 15-year-old girl right now and you're totally immersed in the TikTok world, and we're using TikTok, but other apps are sort of guilty of this. I don't know if guilty is the right word, but they make good use of these algorithms as well. She spends the next decade immersed in this world of short attention demanding clips that kind of get your endorphins up, your dopamine up, and keep you going, keep you swiping or scrolling or what have you. After a certain amount of time, you become conditioned to that. In fact, there are certain medical diagnoses now based on the fact that these people are having tics and they're having involuntary spasms because of their tendency to swipe and use these platforms. So do you think that those ways can be unlearned, and do you think that we can be re-educated through works like yours, hopefully, to be able to sit down and very slowly and deeply appreciate works of great art? Or do you think that it's pretty much lost?
It's a good question. One of the ways to answer that is I'm writing a book now with my father called The 12-Hour Film Expert, the same concept of trying to get as complete an introduction as possible in 12 chapters that would take you about 12 hours to read. And I was looking at a section for action films on chase sequences, famous chase sequences. And the more modern you get, the quicker the edits. And part of the idea of a book like this is you start to watch films in a different way. It's like deconstructionism. You're starting to see, okay, what are the camera angles that I'm looking at? And peeking under the hood, you see that it's really the editor's responsibility for such rapid edits that it amplifies our engagement. We feel like there's more happening. It's more exciting. There's more tension. It's intentionally chaotic, and we are attuned to that. And if we go back in time and look at the most famous chase sequence in film history of the pre-70s era is from the Steve McQueen film Bullet. And it's 10 minutes long, and there's no dialogue. And it's exciting, but it has far less going on. And then we have the next one. It's from The French Connection with Gene Hackman. And it's a little bit more intense. And then if we jump ahead to things like the Bourne movies, which are completely brilliant, they're probably the epitome of what an action film can be. It's just this like chopping and slicing and dicing of edits. And of course, it's more engaging. And I see this with my children too. It's much easier to start them with older films and get them accustomed to the slowness. Because if they start with today's films, then there's little chance for the older films to hold their interest, at least at a young age. When you get to a certain age, then you might be open to such things. But you have to ease in. It's like a little bit of a mindfulness thing. We can tune out because the rapid editing and the insistence on constant forward motion action naturally pulls us in. And you have to opt in and be, one with the moment for a leisurely paced older film that is less stimulating to the brain in a proactive and overt way. So I think you basically have to be in the mood for it and to be willing to chill and slide into a film to get back into the older ways. And I think that's probably applicable across the board. I see this when I'm writing magazine articles. It used to be that people liked long form journalism, and that was actually usually the best writing and the most insightful. And now there's almost no publications that will accept a 3,000 word article. They want 1,500 words maximum for print. And if you're reading online, they think that your attention span is about 800 words. And it's constantly getting smaller. At some point, we're going to want to do the Matrix thing where you have like a USB stick and you put it in your ear and you're downloading information directly. We haven't quite gotten there yet, but it feels like that's the trajectory.
Yeah, and my preference is, as you probably have noted, for longer form, more verbose, more sort of eloquent and honeyed speech and language. And that's absolutely been snuffed out, annihilated, I think, from journalism today.
Yeah.
I prefer...
Keep the fire burning, man. That's
well,
keep burning.
For an audience of one. That's the problem. Now, I love the belles lettres. I love writing as its own art. One of the reasons that I quote from Schiller is because he was that sort of a writer, this sort of poet, philosopher, akin to maybe an Emerson in America, the transcendentalist who writes in this very artistic and beautiful way, but with a message. It's not just poetry. And I've always been drawn to that, and I think it's beautiful. And I think we're really depriving ourselves of a wonderful form of art, I think, at which you would be very good, having all of your knowledge and your experience as a writer, and instead opting for these shorter essays and especially online, these very truncated little, I guess, hit pieces that are just really driven to bring your eyes over that advertisement that's on the on the sidebar, and make it somewhat profitable. But you make a good point, and it's an important one. I think that mindfulness, of which I'm a great proponent, is almost a precondition to being able to truly and deeply appreciate great works of art, whether they be more traditional paintings on canvases or films, like these chase scenes that you're seeing, and the ability to appreciate a Casablanca, which I watched recently with my brother-in-law for the first time, takes some patience, and it takes some, like we said, some mindfulness. You need to be able to settle down into your chair and know, okay, this will be a somewhat long film. Lawrence of Arabia, another good example. You need to be able to sit down and really immerse yourself for a few hours' time. And there might be an intermission during this film, which I always find funny. And be able to maintain your attention, really to be able to absorb the full beauty of that cinematic experience.
I think it's good to basically encourage slowness. There's a Milan Kundera novel called Slowness that I really like, that is basically talking about how we can control how we remember things and make experiences appear longer and more diverse than they actually were by varying locations and the nature of the activities we're doing. And it's like a concept that he put in novel form, but I think you can really do this, and practicing slowness is a good thing. It's also a good thing for us to occasionally feel bored. That sounds like you're not supposed to do that. And we have these phones in our pockets that are guaranteed to keep us entertained at every moment. But for example, I started jogging without listening to podcasts or music, and I start to space out. And then I get really cool ideas that I wouldn't have gotten if I was constantly being stimulated. And so sometimes this like slowing down and being bored is actually inspiring, and it kind of gives your brain like a little holiday. And then it starts cooking up interesting ideas.
So do you think that boredom is a necessary stimulus to artistic creation?
I think it's a necessary stimulus to doing anything that's out of your normal trajectory. So it can be artistic creation, or it could be just, a new idea for your business or something to write about, or for a birthday party for your kid, whatever it's going to be. We are in a sort of tunnel until we're given either a new assignment that forces us out of it, which is what is a good benefit of studying, because it sort of forces you to do things that you wouldn't otherwise, or when your mind is allowed to drift. The other option is if you're sort of under pressured and you have to come up with something because some external force is making you do it. But the friendliest one is just letting yourself space out. And I talk about this, but I need to do it more myself. I recognize the benefits of it. So there's so much reward these days for like motoring ahead and being hyper productive, which is good. But it's also good to just chill and let your mind wander, and not pick up the phone when you have 3 minutes free, but just space out. I think that's beneficial, and it's something that, as a parent, I see like you constantly suggesting ideas for your kids to do if they run out of things to do. But I have to stop myself, because it's good for them to have to figure it out on their own, and they're usually more interested in what they figure out than what was suggested to them.
There we go with the suggestions again, getting back to our platforms that are so capable of doing just that. So my hypothesis is that our inability to engage in boredom is going to have severe and detrimental repercussions on our artistic output in the future. I think that even back to my own childhood, which is increasingly distant, but wasn't that long ago, it was a time just before the full advent of cell phones, and of course the internet existed, but it wasn't something onto which we all scrambled at the drop of a hat. There was still an expectation that you as a child would be out in the world, you'd be out in nature, you'd be exploring a trail, you'd be climbing a tree, you'd be engaging with these natural things by which you were surrounded. And that just doesn't exist anymore. It's far simpler to sit your child down, or as a child to sit down and simply turn on your iPad or your iPhone and stare into it, stare into that abyss, and interminably. So again, it's not a hopeful hypothesis, and I do my desire is that it's proven wrong, but it's the moments of idleness when you're really untasked, you have nothing to do. It's the summertime, you're on vacation from school, and you need to fill your time. And if you don't have the ability to do that inwardly, then you kind of have a great emptiness. There's a great gap in one's mind and in one's soul that needs to be filled somehow, and it is filled with the passing images of TikTok and Instagram and all those sorts of things. So as a parent, I'm sure you are instilling these habits into your children, and I hope that it becomes more common as people of my generation begin bringing their children up into this world. You have to really be proactive about it and think to do it, because the natural instinct is to let yourself be distracted. But I think one of the benefits of things like mindfulness, or the kind of books that you admire that are lavishly written, that aren't just meant to be entertaining and convey information, but you're supposed to sink into them. You have to figure out a way to unplug, and it's literal and figurative here. And sometimes when I'm on holiday, I need a day or so to realize that I don't have to be like in action man mode. And if there's a way to sort of trigger yourself to do that, and do it each day, I think that's a good thing. And that's why, like, if you can get yourself to spend, I don't know, a minute focusing on nothing except fill in the blank element of nature, or a piece of fruit you're eating, or whatever it is, because we also want to do multiple things at once, because we like this feeling of productivity.
So I think we have to train ourselves to do this, and we have to, number one, it's like step one of the program is recognizing you have a problem, and step two is deciding that you want to try to do something about it. So it's not for everyone, but I think it can be done, and then I think you can become more creative, but you have to be cognizant of the fact that there's something proactive that needs to happen on your end. Otherwise, you're sort of on cruise control.
Yeah, I think in some ways we become enslaved to our distractions, and we need to seek freedom. And Schiller, I'll return to him just momentarily. He said that the road of aesthetics must be pursued because it is through beauty that we arrive at freedom. So do you think that we arrive at freedom through beauty? Do you think that foregoing some of these distractions and engaging more deeply with beauty will get us to a more free place?
That's another super question that I've never thought of. The thing is, what he means by beauty, I think, is probably different from what we would think of today. And it's of a different era. I think we can find freedom through thinking outside the box and doing things we don't normally do. So it's not an aesthetic beauty, but it's like this idea of stepping off of the conveyor belt that we're basically standing on. Even if the conveyor belt is lovely and is full of things that we like, it's a finite number of things, and those suggestions we talked about that algorithms offer are essentially giving us more of what it already knows we like. So trying to move away and do something that you don't actually think you like, or maybe you think you won't like, is this feeling of freedom and expansiveness. Like, for example, last night we went to a ballet, and I don't particularly like ballet, and I don't understand enough about it, but going to it was interesting as an experience, and it didn't really hold my interest, but I liked the fact that I was sort of spacing out, and it was lovely, and it was a positive experience, even if it's not something that I'm gonna fall for, but it's expanding my horizons, and that to me is a good thing. So it's a lot of trying things out to see if you like them. You may not, but otherwise you're in this echo chamber of only things that are what you already like or are like what you'd already like. And so I think the freedom is stepping out, and then eventually you're going to discover something that you're totally into that you didn't think you were. And then it's a new horizon open to you.
I want to persist just a little bit further with the idea of beauty. Now, you profess at the end of your book to prefer an Aristotelian approach to art. To that, I cannot but reply, why stop at art? Why not apply an Aristotelian approach to all of life? But Aristotle, along with his teacher Plato, was of the view that there were three transcendentals, of which most of you have heard. And those are, of course, truth, beauty, and goodness. So, in your judgment, which of the three is preeminent? And to which would you say is art most in service?
Wow. Truth, beauty, and goodness. I think goodness is by far the most important one. Art for a long time was seeking truth, but dealing in beauty. Here's a non-answer for you. So the aesthetics of art until really the 20th century was paramount. And so it had to be beautiful, either morally, so like you can have a crucifixion painting that's morally beautiful, even if it's kind of grisly, or aesthetically beautiful. And the idea is that great art is somehow articulating a truth that we can't articulate ourselves. And that could be whether it's like a poem or a piece of music or a painting or sculpture. So that's sort of a non-answer for you, but so I guess all of the above. I don't think it deals with goodness, but that to me is the most important one for humans. That's the quality I look for. Is someone kind? And nothing else interests me if the answer is no. And then everything interests me if the answer is yes. But I like your idea that you can apply this. If we want to sound fancy pants, the Aristotelian tripartite definition for great art. And what he wrote in on poetics, it was basically borrowed by Renaissance scholars and applied to art, because he wasn't talking about what painting, he was talking about poetry and drama. But the basic question you're supposed to ask about every work of art is it good? Meaning, is it well done? Does it exhibit skill? Or in our era of conceptual art, does it successfully achieve what the artist set out to? 2, is it beautiful, which is a subjective decision. It could be morally or aesthetically beautiful. And 3, is it interesting? And that requires an understanding of the context of it and how it compares to other works of art of a similar subject. And if the answer to all of those is yes, then it's a great work of art. And there's a lot of art that is only some of those categories. Like a lot of conceptual art may be interesting, but it's neither beautiful nor exhibits skill. And so it doesn't have the same resonance for me. You can teach yourself to paint well and to exhibit skill, but what you're creating might not be very interesting. Like one of the biggest selling painters in American history, Thomas Kinkade, the painter of light, churned out super cheesy, like middle American living room paintings of little cottages with steam coming out of them, and they were hugely popular, and they were well done because they're realistically painted, and some people found them beautiful, but I don't think anyone actually found them interesting, and so it just doesn't do it for me. So seeking all these things, and I think you can apply that to other aspects of life, which I never thought to do beyond the arts.
Yeah, and you can do it in the moral realm as a side, along with that of the aesthetic. And I think you express what can be a somewhat challenging concept, that Aristotelian tripartite assessment of art, in an excellent way in this book, The 12-Hour Art Expert. And going forward, that's going to be the way in which I assess artwork. Now, maybe in some way I have been doing that already, but certainly after having read your work, I intend to apply it more thoughtfully, because yes, you spell it out very clearly and in a way that's very accessible, like I said, to either the art expert or the novice in this most challenging realm for a lot of people. So I just wanted to say thank you for making it so clear in that book. Again, where you are able very adroitly to balance like I said earlier, the higher brow concepts that you might receive in a lecture performed by you at an institution or at a university, and some things that you might hear, the museum docent or curator whispered to you in passing, things to look out for as you gaze upon a certain work of art.
I appreciate that, because that was really the intention. I also happen to like the more like florid writing styles, but I think that, and I think I say this in the book, art has an intimidation problem.
Yeah.
And so part of my shtick, which is different from other professors like TV presenters and writers, is I'm trying proactively to undercut that, because there are plenty of people writing very beautiful, elegant prose about art, but then they're writing to a very limited audience, and I'm trying to write it for anyone who's willing to make it halfway, which is part of I'm a little bit guilty of what we were talking about earlier, which is trying to appeal to those who feel like they want to absorb a lot as quickly as possible, and trying to basically be a halfway bridge between people who might not turn to art at all, but are maybe a little bit interested, but they're only really interested if they're going to get it in a down-to-earth, quick cut way, so it's relatively concise, and then maybe it's like I'm the gateway drug for people going to the more elegant long form art history prose.
Yeah, and I think your work is a beautiful intermediary between those two sides, between the attention starved dilettante and the aspiring artistic professor, let's say. So
Cool.
yeah,
That's
and
the idea.
yeah, and I think you succeed in that definitively. I think it's a great success. But then you also are able to write a little bit more lavishly and eloquently in other works, like Stealing the Mystic Lamb. I'm looking at that right now, and that's, I would say, still a popular work, but I would think fewer lay people are going to pick that one up than they would the 12-hour art expert. So again, plaudits to you, because I think you balance that just perfectly, and I'm sure it was difficult to restrain yourself and to write for a more popular audience, but you do so very successfully. Now I want to ask you, sort of continuing on our theme of beauty and the transcendentals, and I promise we'll kind of descend from our highbrow flight in a moment or two, but I'm inclined to think that we humans have an inborn love of beauty. It's something to which we're naturally attracted. I think we have an untaught affinity for great music, for instance, maybe even more than pictorial art. For the symphonies of Beethoven and Mozart, to which I think the vibrations of our very souls are tuned. I like to think similarly that we have that relationship to art. So do you think, like me, that humans are innately attracted to great art and that they simply know it when they see it and don't really need too much instruction to understand it? Or do you think that we need to be really thoroughly educated to enjoy great art?
Well, there's a reason why Impressionism is by far the most popular movement worldwide. There isn't a lot going on there. It's studies of how light falls on scenes of real life, usually in nature, and it's aesthetically beautiful. And it's almost like a joke. If you're an Impressionism scholar, then you don't have that much to do except write about the biographies of the artists, because there isn't a lot going on in the paintings. So that is by far the most popular period. There are requirements that people need in order to get the full benefit and engagement with art of older periods in particular, because there's a visual language of symbols that we've forgotten that most people knew in the pre-modern era. Either they were related to mythology or Christianity in Western tradition, or they are sort of encoded in the way we approach works of art and metaphors. So something that everybody probably is familiar with as an icon, but they never really thought of it as such, is like if you drive past a building in your downtown and you see a statue of a woman wearing a blindfold with a sword in one hand and scales on the other. That's an allegorical personification for justice, justitia, which is why it's a woman. It's a female word in Latin, and it's a personification of a concept. And so that one, just about everybody's going to recognize, okay, that's the courthouse. But there used to be not a lot, but probably about 200 or so similar images that once you learn them, you see them everywhere in the Western tradition. And you can walk into a museum and sort of give an impromptu guided tour of much of the collection if you acquaint yourself with these vocabulary words, these visual vocabulary words, I call them. And it's kind of inspiring, because if you think like, okay, I live in Slovenia. If I could teach you 200 words in Slovenian, you would be fluent 80% of the way. That doesn't sound impossible to do, considering what it might open up to you. And it's like that with learning iconography, which is the study of symbols in art. So that part, I think, you basically get a far deeper and more interesting engagement if you are willing to learn this very basic intro to how to read works of art. Otherwise, it's an aesthetic judgment. You like the way it looks and it intrigues you, or it doesn't. And that's why the beauty first, without as much that you have to unpack, is always going to be the most popular. The second most popular is usually surrealism, because they're very skillfully done. It's naturalistic, and they kind of mess with your head in a way that people find pleasurable, and they're very memorable because they're full of surprises. And then you get to abstract art, and this is one thing that I think is fascinating. People find abstract art far more intimidating, even though there's less to understand, than traditional art that they think is more aesthetically successful, but it's full of complicated symbols and stories they may not be familiar with, but it's less scary. And one of the reasons for that is that we have these brains that are trained to interpret things, to draw connections between things, to make stories out of things. We see a shape. This is the Rorschach test concept. We see an ink blot, and our mind naturally wants it to form a shape. And we look outside the window and we see clouds, and we naturally want to say that cloud looks like fill in the blank. Abstract art stops us from doing this because we're trying to, and we can't find anything inside that looks like a story or an image of something we know. And we kind of tend to freak out, and you have to get in the zone. And so people find it much more intimidating, even though there's less to it. So a lot of it is just paving the way for your expectations and not panicking if you aren't quite sure what to make of it. But of course, the default is to like the things that are pretty and not much else. So with apologies to Impressionism scholars, that's my thought.
Yeah, pretty, but superficial. And you provide a very sound education in symbols in your works. For instance, you talk about the crucifixion, right, which is probably the most popularly depicted event in all of art, followed closely by the Annunciation, or the announcement to Mary by the angel Gabriel that she will be bearing the Son of God. So you explain those symbols very elegantly and again very accessibly. But these, like you said, are ideas and images with which the Western mind was completely permeated up until a certain time, not very long ago. It was through these images that people would come to understand life and their religion and their connection with God and the biblical stories and the morality of which they were the inheritors. So it's interesting that we've almost starved ourselves of these symbols as we've proceeded toward a less biblical, I would say, understanding of the world, or a less theological appreciation of the world. But these were just common, so common that the most vulgar person or the most ill-educated person could understand by looking at the stained glass window that, Gabriel with these parrot-colored wings pointing to the sky and holding a lily, as you describe in your book, is indicating something not just pretty, but very profound, right? In the symbol of the lily, or in the color of his wings, or in the gesture of his hand. And it's a shame that we lack this understanding. But again, people like you are reacquainting us with these symbols, and I think that's absolutely invaluable. So let me ask you.
What you make is quite literal, like that. It was literally for people with no education who couldn't read that we had this visual language. And I think just to conclude the thought, one of the issues is that we've shifted away from symbolic readings of texts or images or life in general, and to something far more literal. We want to be handed things in an overt way. And previous generations and centuries saw people who were more willing to work for it, and it was more puzzle-based and symbol-based, and it was one step removed from literally saying what we mean. And maybe there's something collectively lost in the shift from that.
Yeah, isn't it interesting how in centuries past these works of art were, to some extent, let's say stained glass works of art, were to some extent deliberately made for the edification of the poor and the ill-educated. and they could understand every symbol. Whereas today, you can find the most highly educated person who might be completely puzzled by these very same images from which the least educated once got their education. I think that's actually
a good point.
An interesting reversal through the course of the ages. So speaking of the ages, I want to ask you, is there an artistic golden age? We see it in his works and days. He talks about the golden age of man, right? We sort of referenced this when we were talking about Schiller and the fact that he or many of the critics of the modern era in which they live will lament the fact that they're missing something of the aesthetic sense. But was there ever a time when it was generally agreed that this aesthetic sense was at its climax, and that there was a generally high regard for artistic work, and the artistic work was actually commensurate with that regard? It was at its summit. So was there an artistic golden age, and if so, when was it?
So there have been many, but they were geographically specific. So there wasn't one that was, planet wide. But Athens at its summit was the one that most later eras pointed to as good as it gets when it comes to civilization. So we're talking the pinnacle of the Athenian democracy in terms of theater, poetry, thought, and art. That was the place to be. And other generations later looked back at it. So when Rome was the world power, it was modeling its creations on essentially what Athens did. There were some other Hellenistic city-states as well, but Athens was the place to be. And then the Renaissance is French for rebirth. It was a rebirth of the interest in the classical world, by which they meant Rome and Greece, but Rome was getting its groove from Athens. But then there were other periods too. It's just location specific. So the court of Burgundy in the 1430s. If we look at much of the 15th and the first quarter of the 16th century in Florence and Rome, and in Venice, with the golden age of Spanish painting with Velázquez. 1950s and 60s New York was a golden age for abstract painting and abstract expressionism. So Paris in the second half of the 19th century. So it depends on the place and the location, but I think everyone you asked at these different eras would probably point you back to ancient Athens as that was the place to be.
And under which epoch or period would you like to have lived?
If you can guarantee me I'm not going to get any plagues, then we can start talking.
You're inoculated. You're time traveling as an inoculated man. You have There's no risk.
Okay.
Of
I mean, but the time period that I study the most and find the most interesting is the Mannerist era in Florence. So we're talking basically from the death of Raphael until the middle of the 16th century. So let's say 1500 to 1545, right around there would be prime time for me in Florence. And it's good because that's like a lifetime could be focused and it's in one location. And most of the artists I like best were working there. And it's funny because Florence, if you've ever been, it can feel big if it's your first time, but I've taught there and lived there, and it's really like a small Tuscan hilltop town that happens to have a gazillion tourists because it has so much amazing stuff crammed into it. It's really very small. They symbolize themselves as David from the David and Goliath story because they were very small, and they're trying to make sure that no giant Goliath empires tried to muscle in because they were going to kick some ass if they did. And they just had an incredible core of all of the best artists from not just the Italian peninsula, but elsewhere in Europe. They all were focused in on Florence, circa 1500 and for the next few decades. So that's where I'd hang out.
And you would have no qualms living under the influence of the Medici?
They weren't so bad. There's been plenty of bad despots, and they were quite all right. I think it's all relative. If you're gonna pick a despot, then they'll do.
Yeah, of all the desirable or undesirable despots, they might be the least undesirable. So
Yeah.
I think in response to that question, I might go back to Athens,
Okay.
or to the age in which there was either the rediscovery of a lot of these bronze sculptures, be it I guess it would be in the age of Rome. I mean, it would maybe be the Roman Republic, the late Roman Republic, or even the Roman imperial time, or in the Renaissance. I think that would absolutely be fascinating to be unearthing these partial bronze statues that probably adorned Athens and many similar Greek cities many hundreds of years ago at that point, and just to be shocked and astonished by these absolutely impressive displays of human creativity and brilliance that you then base your own artistic heritage off of would be just, I think, endlessly interesting.
There's a moment you could go back to that's very specific, actually. I think it was 1506. I have to remind myself, but there was a moment when there was an excavation of the Domus Aurea, which was Nero's palace in Rome, and in circa 1500, it was essentially buried under centuries of rubbish and ruin and building up, so that the level of present-day Rome is about 2 meters higher than Rome in the time of ancient Rome. And there was a day when people excavated the Laocoon group sculpture, which is maybe the most famous sculpture of the classical world. And Michelangelo had many different hats that he wore, but one of them, he was basically keeper of antiquities for the papacy. He was like the curator or archaeologist. And so he had to head on down and check out what they excavated. And it was the single most influential day of his life, because the forms that he saw in this sculpture, which was unlike anything anyone had ever seen before, directly influenced what he did. And then what he did was the influence for Mannerism, which is the period following his death, when artists were inspired by him and carried on his work. So that'd be a good day. I'll go with you to Rome. We'll grab a pizza and an espresso and go watch Michelangelo on excavating the Laocoon group.
Oh, excellent. And I find he's a particularly fascinating figure about whom I need to learn more. And I plan to purchase Vasari's book that I learned about from having read your book.
Great.
But Michelangelo was, a poet. He was a painter. He was a sculptor and an excavator, a government official. So he had all these interesting roles, properly deserving of the name Renaissance man or polymath, that we very kind of casually toss around today. But really just a prodigiously talented and prolific person, the likes of which we haven't seen since. So I want to move very briefly. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention art thievery. So far as I can tell, it's a somewhat understudied subject of which you are universally acknowledged to be an expert. So, we're talking about an asset that's quite immune to the indignity of depreciation. It seems only to increase in value over time, and thus increase in its exposure to thievery. So unsurprisingly, thieves are forever scheming up new ways to steal it. So what stirred your interest in this field of study, art thievery?
So there's a specific story about this. It goes back to when I decided I wanted to try to write. And when I was a postgraduate student living in Rome, I wanted to be a playwright. And I actually managed to get an agent for my plays. I can't believe that happened, but it did at the time. But she said, if you want to make money as a writer, you should write a novel. Have you got one? And I said, no, but I'll go write one. So I wrote a novel, which was my first book, The Art Thief. And it was behind the scenes in the art world, which I had experienced as a student and early in working life. And I had read the Da Vinci Code, and I enjoyed it, but I was really annoyed by all the historical errors in it. It just felt like nobody had bothered to research or to fact check. But of course, I liked the sales figures and wanted a little bit of that, and it was really fun to read. And I also had seen the remake of the Thomas Crown Affair, which is a super film with Pierce Brosnan, which is about art theft. And I thought, well, maybe if I can borrow some of the vibe of those two, but I want to make sure mine is historically and criminologically feasible, all the things, the set pieces I'm doing. So I did a lot of research, and I realized there's almost nothing written on the subject. There are a handful of academic books, but very little. There were a lot of journalistic accounts, but I very quickly read everything that I could find, even things that were out of print, because there were like 100 books total, let's say, something like that. It was surprisingly small. And so I very quickly became the leading expert in this field. I think of myself as a historian of art crime because they're actual people catching bad guys who have much more experience in the field. But if I can get their stories and look at it from a criminological and historical standpoint, then that's the thing that I'm best known for. So I put all of this in a novel. So I came up to it backwards. Normally you'd think you already know about something, so then you write about it. I was trying to write a novel, and then I researched in order to do so. And because so few people studied it, I was still 20-something, and then all of a sudden I was the go-to specialist in the field. And that helped, to be honest. Like, it's not so good to be a generalist. Career advice 101, it's best to hyper specialize in one very narrow thing, so you're the world's go-to person in fill in the blank, and it's much easier to establish yourself that way than trying to do a little bit of a lot of things, even if you do a little bit of a lot of things well. So it helped for me to be basically the art crime guy.
So it was on the wave of enthusiasm following the release of the Da Vinci Code that you got into this study of art thievery. Very interesting, very interesting. So on that note, there is one piece of art, a triptych or a 3-paneled work that enjoys the distinction of being the most stolen, and that is the Adoration of the Mystic Lamb, or the Ghent altarpiece. Now, I'll admit, when I first read the name of the title of this work, I was reminded of a trip I took to Charlotte, North Carolina around this time last year. And the section in which I stayed was this sort of eclectic hipster type place called Midwood. And it was rife with all these restaurants and bars with names like the Giddy Goat and the Peculiar Rabbit and the Smooth Monkey, all sorts of interesting names like that. And my first thought upon looking at the book Stealing the Mystic Lamb, of which I have a copy right here, was that it was the name of some sort of hipster-inspired artisan cafe, but it's not, of course. So tell us all a little bit about the Mystic Lamb, as I know briefly, as a work of art, and just why so many thieves have sought it.
So for me, this is an easy focal point for all the things I'm interested in. So it's easy to argue that this is the single most influential painting ever made, and the most important painting ever made, because it was the start of an interest in oil painting, which became the preferred medium for the next 450 years or so. And it's also the most frequently stolen work of art, and just about anything bad that can happen to a painting has happened to this one. So for me, it is the perfect nexus of everything I'm interested in. So it was finished in 1432. It was painted by Jan van Eyck. And when it was painted, it was the most famous work of art in the world, and it was a point of pilgrimage for anyone interested in art traveling in Europe. And it was on display in the Cathedral of Ghent in Belgium. And because it was so famous, it became a magnet for people to take either in war or for personal profit. And they're about, I say about, depending on your definition of crimes, there are 13 bad things that happened to this one painting over about 600 years, including having been stolen either 6 or 7 times, depending on your definition of theft. And it has the unfortunate distinction of also being in a territory, Flanders in Belgium, that has been the battleground for a lot of European-wide conflicts. So when you get to Ghent, first thing you do, you steal the mystic lamb because everyone else is doing it. So the Napoleonic War, First World War, and Second World War, it was a primary target. And so the book is a biography of an object, and it's easier for us to cheer for people. Biographies of humans, we humans tend to find it easier to sympathize with other humans. So part of the challenge is, if the protagonist is an inanimate object, a piece of art, can we imbue it with enough that you're sort of cheering for it to be saved and to make it as interesting as possible? And so it's a lot of isms. It was the first realist work. It was the first impermanent oil painting. It has a sort of A to Z of Catholic mysticism, so all the symbols involved, and that interests me because I like to teach about art as like a detective story, visual puzzles. And in this case, there's also a real detective story because one of the 12 panels is still missing. So for me, this is like the perfect lens of everything that I'm into.
Yeah, and you provide pictures of it in your book, and you see immediately that this is not an inconspicuous little piece of artwork. I mean, it's quite large and unwieldy, and to imagine it's being stolen and hidden and transferred to, between Napoleonic houses of collection and Hitler's underground layers is unfathomable. It's really crazy to think that these panels could have been moved around so many times, and yet they're overall, I would think, intact.
They're 11/12 intact, so that's pretty good, all things considered. So one panel that was stolen in 1934 has never been found, and there is still an open investigation. The Ghent police always have an officer assigned to the case, even now, and there's some crazy tips they get that they really follow through on, and still missing. So I have a feeling one of these days it'll be found, and it'll be a very exciting day, and then we'll all go to Ghent for beer and fries.
I think it's about time for you to get out your baton and your detective badge and get on the case yourself. Get away from the study and the desk and get out into the field and find it.
I honestly did come across some clues that I passed on to the Ghent police. And I have a few thoughts, but you got to have a warrant to follow through with them. I'll leave it at that. So I'll leave it to the professionals.
Yeah, that's probably wise. So we're going to conclude with one question more. Now, I won't ask you to disclose your favorite work of art. I think you're on record for declaring that to be Bronzino's Allegory of Love and Lust, which is an endlessly fascinating piece of art, to which I'll surely include a link in the show notes below. It was quite an experience just to look at it in your work, to read your description of it, and then with a little bit of subsequent research to go online and really examine it a little bit more closely. And it's quite an experience, to put it mildly. So I know that that's your favorite work of art. It might be mine now as well. But the question I ask is a little bit different. What was the first work of art that completely overwhelmed you? The first work of art that shook your foundations and caused your soul to quiver?
That's the Teotaka Madonna on the island of Torcello off of Venice. I'm not sure that's the earliest one, but that's the one that first came to mind, and it's certainly early on. It's mosaic, which normally I wouldn't think it has the ability to be so moving, but it's the kind of the only one that it didn't actually make me cry, but it got closest enough to it of any work that I've seen. And part of what I like about it is I like works of art that you have to sort of take a pilgrimage to get to. That museums are great, but it's almost too easy. I like it, looking forward to seeing a single work that you have to make a journey for, and then the anticipation and the fulfillment of actually seeing it is much more exciting than if the same work were at a museum with 2,000 other works. So you really have to go to Venice, then you have to take a traghetto out to Torcello, and if it's not summertime, you might be in the church where it's located on your own. And there's something about the expression on Mary's face that just zinged me. So that would be my answer.
Amazing. And I'm sure it struck you with an immediacy and a profundity that is hardly expressible in words.
Mm-hmm. It's this idea of truth and beauty that we talked about earlier, and goodness. There we go. This is a good tying up from earlier in the conversation. There's something about the look in her eyes that some artists who depict Mary take advantage of, but most don't. And this is the idea that if you're told that the only reason that your child was created was in order to die, do you have a different sort of maternal dynamic with the child, and is it one constantly laced with sadness, or is it just, until someone comes up with an eternal life potion? You could say that about every child, just they usually don't predecease their parents. But so something about that, she knows what's going to happen in his future, is in her eyes, and that is really hard to do when you're sculpting in like pieces of glass or stone. You think of mosaics as more of a blunt instrument than a scalpel. So hats off to the anonymous mosaicist who made that.
Oh my goodness, and it's anonymous, so without attribution. That is amazing, and such a heartfelt description of your reason for so enjoying that piece of artwork. And you're absolutely right. If you can capture that image, that look of foreknowledge and concern in Mary's eyes, it almost tempts one to convert, if he's not a Christian, to that beautiful religion. And I think you're absolutely right. It's that convergence. Great works of art are that convergence of truth, beauty, and goodness, again, which is something that is said to be in Jesus, in Christ himself, or in God, or in whatever divinity in which you believe, or greater power in which you believe. It's that unity of the three things. So with that profound thought, Noah, I have to thank you so much for joining me today on this episode. I'll be sure to include links to all of your books, but especially the two most recently published that I think everyone should purchase and keep in their houses. They're very informative and very accessible. Now, are there any other social media sites or platforms that people should know about to better be able to reach out to you and contact you?
Sure. The only one I really like is Instagram. I'm so old I don't even have TikTok, and I've never actually seen it. So so Instagram is my tag is Slovenology, because I live in Slovenia and I'm running around there. Or noahcharney.com you can take a look at. And I have forthcoming in May, I'm teaching a series of 4 online lectures for Atlas Obscura about famous art crimes. So if anybody's interested in that subject, they can check that out as well. But I want to thank you for being such a good interviewer. I get interviewed a lot, but it's always the same questions. And you have a lot of questions I've never been asked before, and you really did your homework. So hats off. It's a very impressive job as an interviewer.
Oh, thank you so very much. I pride myself on coming from left field and trying to rattle you a little bit, but you were completely unperturbed and eloquent in all of your responses. Again, I've been the beneficiary of both of your books. I'm planning to read everything else that you have to offer. And I've recommended them all very enthusiastically and highly to everyone who will listen. And of course, everyone who's so inclined, you can subscribe to this channel, Finneran's Wake, and also to my sister project, Numa Meditations, where we discuss mindfulness and other things to which we were making reference a little bit earlier. And with that, I thank you very much for your time. Noah, you've been amazing, and I hope to talk to you again in the future.
I would love to come back. Thank you so much, and have a good one.
All right. Thank you, and farewell.